normal, hard-working people in Ashfield are being made homeless by companies and landlords seeking more profit as their homes are converted into HMOs. In Ashfield, there are a supposed...
What is up, everybody? Oscar here, and welcome back to the channel. This debate right here is a perfect example of how Britain's housing crisis and immigration politics are now being fused together in an incredibly explosive way. Because in this clip, Lee Anderson goes on a full rant inside Parliament about HMOs, community decline, asylum seekers being housed in local neighborhoods, and what he claims is happening to working-class British communities across places like Ashfield. Now, let's be honest, concerns around overcrowded housing, antisocial behavior, bad landlords, and broken local planning absolutely are real issues. HMOs can become a serious problem when they're poorly regulated, and communities feel abandoned by local authorities. Nobody reasonable denies that. But what makes this speech controversial is the way the argument quickly shifts from housing regulation into broader fear-driven rhetoric around migrants, backward cultures, and asylum seekers supposedly becoming the central reason entire communities are deteriorating. So in this video, we're going to break down exactly what Lee Anderson said, the political messaging behind it, what parts of the argument reflect legitimate public frustration, and where the rhetoric starts crossing into fear-based scapegoating and culture war politics. If you enjoy sharp political analysis that cuts through the noise, hit like, subscribe to Backbench Briefing, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Britain's leaders are actually solving the housing crisis? Or are politicians using immigration as the easier political target? Alright, now let's get into it.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I do agree with the Article 4 legislation used to put HMOs through the planning process at local councils. It's something that I've forced my local council to do, but unfortunately they're only doing it in certain areas. I like to see it across the whole constituency. I will give way, yeah.
Adam Jogi.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm grateful to the gentleman for giving way, and I thank him for securing this debate and congratulate him on that. I wonder if he'd agree with me, and indeed the Honourable Member from Hertfordshire, that should also apply to the Conservative-run council in Newcastle-under-Lyme, who should be applying Section 4 sooner rather than later.
Lee Anderson.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I think that's a matter for local councils to decide upon. I know in my area, HMOs are a big problem, and I'm glad that they've used Article 4 in certain areas. I'd like to see it rolled out to the whole constituency. But I get back to my point, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have druggies, criminals, wrong-uns, living sometimes 6 at a time in one small house on streets that were once considered a good place to live. And the decent folk who can afford to leave these streets are leaving in their droves. The problem there is that the investors, the landlords, then buy up their houses and turn them into HMOs. But the other decent people that live on the street, that can't afford to move, they have to stay there and put up with a life of misery. And this problem, Madam Deputy Speaker, is getting worse and worse. And I know the Labour front bench and the backbench MPs bang on about emptying the hotels full of illegal migrants. And nobody wants a hotel full of illegal migrants in their area. Nobody wants young fighting-age males, 400 of them sometimes, from backward cultures that treat our women as second-class citizens. We don't want them roaming our streets. But the hotels are now being emptied. And where are these young men going to go? I'll tell you where they're going to go. They're going to go into a HMO on the street near people in this chamber, near my family, near my friends, near my neighbours. And we've had enough of this. We've got enough of our own homegrown nuisances in this country without importing even more to live in HMOs.
Will the Honourable Member give way?
I will give way.
I'm most grateful to him for giving way. Does he share my concern that the growing proliferation of these houses of multiple occupation is leading to whole streets being transformed, communities being torn apart with no sense of engagement from those occupying these HMOs, leading to rubbish, to mess, destitution, disruption and utter chaos in streets and whole communities?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I think what he's trying to say, I put it more succinctly, is that these HMOs and the proliferation, as it says, is turning some of our areas into ghettos. Now, I've seen in Ashfield where, because of the HMOs being filled with young men, some young girls are frightened to walk the same streets. They've even changed their route to school. This is unacceptable. This is not right in 2026, that young girls, young British girls are having to change the way they walk to school. It's not fair on our citizens. The illegal migrants I talk about have been dispersed amongst our communities in HMOs. As I said before, mostly young men from backward cultures. Some have medieval views towards our women and girls. Yet women and girls tell me they are more afraid now to walk our streets than they've ever been. Nobody deserves this. And to make matters even worse, this government, and the previous government, to be fair, have allowed Serco to hoover up HMOs on 7-year deals and fill them full of illegal migrants, which has meant it is even now more difficult for British people to find accommodation. And this has also led to a huge increase in rents in places like Ashfield. The increase in HMOs in places like Ashfield has meant that Ashfield born and bred people are becoming homeless in our own town. This is an absolute disgrace. Normal, hard-working people in Ashfield are being made homeless by companies and landlords seeking more profit as their homes are converted into HMOs. In Ashfield, there are supposedly 110 asylum seekers living in this sort of accommodation at the taxpayers' expense. And it is shameful that we've had nurses kicked out of the HMOs, nurses that work at my local hospital, the same hospital where I was born, kicked out of their HMOs because Serco has taken over the contract and they've been replaced by illegal migrants. We're supposed to be here in this place to make people's lives better, but we're making it worse. But there is a solution to all of this, because HMOs should not be the problem. It's the management of HMOs that's the problem. I recently spoke to Richard Pursglove in my constituency, who runs Pursglove Property. Now, he's housed thousands of people over the past 15 years in HMOs with zero antisocial incidents. And he told me that done properly, HMOs are a convenient, affordable housing for nurses, key workers and single professionals. Now, I agree with him. HMOs can be a good thing for people in need of housing. I think we all know that. But the problem is there is no regulation around HMO management. HMO management is different from a standard let. When you let 6 unrelated people, normally men, live together with no checks in place, what could possibly go wrong? Well, there is plenty going wrong, and it's making the lives of residents in my constituency a complete living hell. HMO owners can't do DPS checks, they can't use Clare's law, they can ask difficult questions to potential tenants, but the applicants have no obligation to answer truthfully. But what could we do to make HMOs in our communities more acceptable? Well, legislation for one, licensing for HMO managers and owners, qualifications, training, accountability. Landlords and managers must also be held accountable for managing their properties as well as disruptive behaviour. This should be a condition of any licensing granted. We need vigorous background checks on all tenants. There should be a separate licensing agreement or a tier for agents housing higher risk people, people with mental health problems, vulnerable adults, etc. There should be access for licensed HMO managers to proper safeguarding tools, as I said before, DBS checks and access to Clare's law. There should be a statutory limit on how many HMOs can open up in one particular area. And my last ask, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the Minister is to stop placing illegal migrants in HMOs. detain and deport for the sake of our young women and girls. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Lee Anderson is tapping into something very real emotionally, people feeling like their communities are changing too fast. Housing is becoming unaffordable. Public services are stretched, and politicians have lost control of the system. And if mainstream parties ignore those feelings completely, they're going to keep losing voters to populists who know exactly how to weaponize fear and anger. Anderson, like a lot of right-wing populists across Britain right now, starts blending legitimate housing concerns with broad, fear-based narratives about migrants in a way that oversimplifies a much deeper crisis. Britain's housing crisis did not begin with asylum seekers. It did not begin with HMOs. It did not begin with migrants. This crisis has been building for decades because successive governments failed to build enough affordable housing, allowed private rents to spiral out of control, deregulated parts of the housing market, slashed local authority funding, and basically treated housing as an investment asset before treating it as a human necessity. Now, does that mean poorly managed HMOs cannot damage communities? Of course not. Anderson is actually correct on some points when he talks about overcrowding, antisocial behavior, irresponsible landlords, lack of oversight, and the pressure concentrated housing can place on neighborhoods. Those are genuine policy issues that absolutely deserve serious regulation. But notice how quickly this speech moves from we need better HMO management into young fighting age males from backward cultures and illegal migrants turning areas into ghettos. Take complicated structural failures, housing shortages, stagnant wages, NHS strain, rising rents, economic insecurity, and compress them into one emotionally satisfying target: migrants. Because it is much easier politically to point at vulnerable outsiders than to confront decades of policy failure, corporate profiteering, austerity, and weak governance. Politicians know exactly what they're doing. They understand fear is politically profitable. Outrage spreads faster than nuance. Our communities are under threat generates far more emotional engagement. But here's what also frustrates people. And Democrats, labor supporters, and progressives need to understand this if they actually want to win these debates long term. Dismissing every concern about immigration as racism is politically lazy and strategically stupid. People do worry about social cohesion. They do worry about pressure on services. They do worry about rapid change in communities. And when political leaders refuse to even acknowledge those anxieties, respectfully, populists step into that vacuum immediately. The answer cannot simply be, you're wrong for feeling worried. The answer has to be, your frustrations are real, but you're being sold the wrong explanation. Because the real scandal here is not asylum seekers existing. The real scandal is that Britain is wealthy enough to house people properly, and still somehow has nurses being priced out, working families struggling to rent, young people unable to buy homes, and local communities feeling abandoned all at the same time. That is not just an immigration issue. That is a systemic political failure. And honestly, that's the part a lot of these political grifters never want their audience to think too deeply about. Because if Britain deported every asylum seeker tomorrow, would that suddenly solve the housing shortage? Would rents magically collapse? Would NHS waiting times disappear? Would decades of underinvestment suddenly reverse overnight? Of course not. And they know that doesn't mean borders should not exist. It doesn't mean governments should not manage immigration competently. It doesn't mean communities should simply absorb unlimited pressure without planning or support. But it does mean serious adults should be capable of separating legitimate policy debate from fear-based political storytelling. But I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think politicians are honestly addressing Britain's housing crisis? Are concerns about HMOs and migration being handled fairly? Drop your thoughts below, subscribe to Backbench Briefing, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.